Donald Trump stated that he would strengthen sanctions against Russia, but only if all NATO members do the same, stop buying Russian oil and impose higher tariffs against China. Thus, Trump officially stated that he does not intend to impose any sanctions against Putin's regime, as he simply found others to blame for his inaction. After all, Trump understands perfectly well that countries like Hungary and Slovakia, whose leaders support the American president, will not quickly give up Russian energy resources. Moreover, Europe now claims that they are on the verge of a major economic deal with India, and Europe is not ready to enter into an economic confrontation with China. But besides Europe, there is also Turkey, which is very likely not to agree to stop buying Russian oil. In addition, some European countries continue to buy Russian liquefied natural gas. And in this situation, Trump simply found an excuse for why he personally hasn't punished the Kremlin dictator for so long. My name is Alexei Pecci. It's September 15th on the calendar. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we begin, let me remind you that on this YouTube channel, several news and analytical stories about events around the world are released every day so that you can stay fully informed. That's why I recommend subscribing to this YouTube channel and ask you to like this episode. United States President Donald Trump said he's ready to impose new sanctions on Russia, but only under one impossible condition. If all NATO members do the same, stop buying Russian oil and impose higher tariffs against China, which, by the way, he himself still hasn't done. And, as Trump wrote, quote, massive sanctions against Russia when all NATO members do the same, and when all NATO countries stop buying Russian oil. So, on one hand, the Populist claim that Trump is absolutely right. Well, there is some rationality here. Trump himself added that NATO's readiness to achieve victory is significantly less than 100%, and the amount of Russian oil purchased by some alliance members is shocking. Quote, this significantly weakens your position in negotiations and your leverage over Russia. In any case, I'm ready to start whenever you are. Just let me know when. Well, go on. Trump called on countries to collectively raise tariffs against China to the level of 50 to 100%. Without this, according to Trump, NATO countries are, quote, wasting the United States' time. That's why the United States just washes its hands of it and minds its own business. On the other hand, Trump's new conditions are almost certain not to be met. And Trump himself, as well as all his advisors and his team, are well aware of this. For example, the largest European buyers of Russian oil, Hungary, Slovakia, and Turkey, are highly unlikely to stop their purchases as soon as tomorrow. And paradoxically, the leaders of Hungary and Slovakia, Viktor Orban and Robert Fico, are huge supporters of Donald Trump, and it's obvious that Trump has influence over them. It's easier to justify your own inaction by pointing to your partner's inaction. Well, to be fair, even though most European countries have significantly reduced their oil imports from Russia, some European Union members are still buying liquefied natural gas from them. That's worth noting. But there's also a third side. It's the reputation of Donald Trump himself, who is already being openly laughed at by many because of his loud but empty threats and ultimatums. Unfortunately, all dictators have already clearly understood and realized for themselves that Trump's threats are absolutely worthless. Trump regularly threatens some measures against Russia, but he always leaves himself the option not to follow through, and in the end, he doesn't. And in the American president's administration, they believe that a summit with President Vladimir Putin in Alaska would lay the groundwork for direct talks between Putin and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. After that, it would be possible to hold a trilateral meeting of the leaders Trump, Putin, and Zelensky. However, Trump rejected this idea, emphasizing that Putin would not agree to a ceasefire. And today Trump is already saying, listen, Putin and Zelensky hate each other so much that they will never meet or talk. The only question is, where was Donald Trump with this idea during the previous 8 months of his presidency? And where were his ears, which absolutely didn't hear exactly the same thing from Ukrainians and Europeans? Putin won't agree to any reasonable negotiations. He needs war. Well, and today, after all these empty threats and ultimatums, Trump simply stated that now it's also necessary to determine who is more to blame for this war, Russia or Ukraine? He says, well, we need to figure this out. But the issue isn't just about Ukraine. From the latest news, it's worth noting that on September 10, the Polish authorities reported Russian drones being shot down over their territory. On Thursday, September 11, when Trump was asked about this incident, let's call it that, he replied that it could have been a mistake. However, he confirmed that he condemns what happened. This episode showed how little Trump cares about the security of all of Europe, not just Ukraine. And now I want to openly invite supporters of Donald Trump who wrote to me in the comments on this YouTube channel saying that I simply didn't understand the deep intentions of Donald Trump to a discussion, and that he's just about to punish Putin for sure and the war will stop. Please write what was the intention. Or maybe you'll finally admit that Trump just embarrassed himself in front of the whole world and turned out to be weak and ineffective. But let me remind you that the Trump and Putin summit in Alaska took place on August 15 too. A month earlier, the American president issued an ultimatum about resolving the war in Ukraine, warning that if Putin didn't agree to talks, consequences would follow. Then came another ultimatum, followed by more deadlines. Earlier, Trump's special representative Steve Witkoff met with the Russian dictator in Moscow. The talks between Trump and Putin in Alaska lasted about 3 hours. Afterward, the American president came out and announced that there was no deal. Later, Trump met with Zelensky in the White House, then spoke with Putin again by phone, after which he announced preparations for direct talks between the presidents of Russia and Ukraine. Trump told journalists that, in his opinion, it would not be a problem at all for Russia if European troops were stationed in Ukraine. However, after that, someone named Peskov, Putin's press secretary, comes out and emphasizes that the Kremlin has a negative attitude toward this idea. Just like me, allegedly. The expansion of NATO was one of the original reasons for the war. As a result, at the beginning of September, Trump stated that Russia and Ukraine are not ready for peace yet. And again, a rhetorical question. So what are Donald Trump's words worth in this story? And by demanding that Europe be the first to impose sanctions against Russia and its allies, Trump raises another pressing issue. The issue of anti-Russian sanctions was already a delicate topic for the United States, and now, because of the demands of the American president, it threatens Europe with a worsening of relations with China, which is a partner of the Russian Federation. And, as the French newspaper Le Monde writes, Trump is trying to improve relations with Moscow and is in no hurry to impose sanctions, despite the demands of European allies who see this as a way to force Putin to stop the war against Ukraine. In Europe, Trump's demands to impose 100% tariffs against China are not supported, although Trump himself has not imposed these tariffs either, even though he came up with this punitive measure himself. And here I'll just give a telling quote from Le Monde. The European Union cannot agree to the conditions put forward by the occupant of the White House regarding raising customs duties on Chinese imports. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't take measures, but for now there will be no excessive customs duties, assured the European diplomat. I don't see Europeans joining forces with Trump against China. It's very difficult for Europeans to trust Washington when it comes to relations with Beijing. It would be terrible if our policy towards China depended on the United States. Added the diplomat. The publication noted that the European Union is afraid of paying the price for the trade war between Washington and Beijing, turning into a dumping ground for Chinese goods. He also does not intend to deprive himself of the Chinese market in the name of sanctions against Russia, preferring to target companies that circumvent these sanctions. As European economists are now saying, Europe's goal is to impose tough sanctions against the Russian economy, aimed at direct or indirect trade with Moscow, but not at further weakening the European economy itself. They say the idea of tariffs is destructive for the European economy itself. This position also applies to India, which is currently negotiating a free trade agreement with the European Union, seen as a countermeasure to the increase in tariffs. Europeans need to sell it, and since it's tougher in the United States now, they have to turn to India. A European official noted that the European Union will not impose tariffs against India as this goes against European interests. Well, it's convenient for Trump to say, listen, I'm ready, but Europe isn't ready, so I won't do anything either. That's all of Donald Trump's threats. He made loud threats, loudly issued ultimatums, set deadlines, all these threats, changes of position, and so on. He says, I'm not against it, I'm ready anytime. Europe doesn't want to, so it's their fault. Let them do it, and then I'll come up with another 2 weeks for Putin. That's the situation. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.